and welcome, my Pontiac High School students. Today we are looking at establishing a new government. We're going to be looking at this guy right here, George Washington. Spend a little bit of time with him. All right, 1789, the Constitution is ratified and a new government is formed. This is really when the United States begins, at least the United States that we know of and we think of today. 1776 was independence from Britain, but what we had in between 1776 and 1789 was something else. This is now the United States proper. To get things going, the Electoral College, this group of expert politicians, get together to choose the president of the United States, and they unanimously chose George Washington. He was this one solid unifying figure that everybody in the United States could get behind. John Adams was selected as vice president. He had really been a behind-the-scenes kind of guy pushing for the Declaration of Independence, pushing for support for the United States during the Revolutionary War, and was now being kind of rewarded for all that hard work with the vice presidency. Now, George Washington, he was a reluctant president, by which I mean he didn't really think that he would be good. He didn't feel that this was a job that he would excel at. He didn't see himself as a politician, but he did accept this job because I think he realized when he stepped back that he was one individual who commanded the respect of the nation and one individual who could get the nation off on its right foot. So he did accept this role. And once he did so, he plays an incredibly important role in American history because he's the first president. There's so many questions about what should a president do? How should a president act? Washington answered them simply by making a decision and being the first. He became a model for all future presidents and therefore set an incredibly important precedent for the American presidency. So the three branches of government, all three branches had to learn how to function. They had to learn how to do their job. The Constitution of the United States gives kind of some broad guidelines, but no real specifics. The Constitution is a framework, but now they need to build on that framework and make it something a little bit more solid, a little bit more meaningful. The legislative branch was one of those three branches of government, head up by the Congress, first meets in March 1789. And the first thing that they do is they quickly get to work on writing the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So right away, they get to work on changing it. But the Bill of Rights will add a whole bunch of personal freedoms and liberties and protections that the Constitution had not guaranteed. It also addressed the strength of government concerns. People were worried that the federal government, the central government, would become too strong. So the Bill of Rights reserved some powers for the states. Now, James Madison, surprise, surprise, winds up being a major sponsor of the amendments. He is, of course, the guy who wrote the Constitution, the Virginia Plan, which became the Constitution. Now he's also the major sponsor of the amendments. So if James Madison wasn't already immensely important to know, he's even more so now. And one day he'll be president. So kind of an important guy. Executive branch. The executive branch is led by the President of the United States. And the Constitution allows the president to form executive departments. But it never really gets into what those are. Well, Washington kind of invents them. He says, all right, well, we need some departments. And it went to Congress for approval for the creation of 4 departments. The Department of State, Department of War, Department of Treasury, and Department of Justice. These offices and the men that lead them became known as the President's Cabinet. The President's Cabinet are his close advisors, and these were his first 4 cabinet members. We have good old TJ, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. It's going to be the Secretary of State. Henry Knox, a military leader during the Revolutionary War, will become the Secretary of War. Alexander Hamilton, there's a play about him on Broadway, will become the Secretary of Treasury. And Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, the largest, wealthiest, most populous state, becomes the head of the Justice Department, the Attorney General. And these 4 men really make it their job to be experts in this one particular job of the president. so that the president didn't need to be an expert in all of them. He could just manage these four. So that's the president's cabinet and the role of the president. Now we're moving on to the judicial branch. The judicial branch is the United States Supreme Court. Today it includes 9 justices, although that was not the case back then. And they are going to rule on the constitutionality of state and federal laws. That is, they're going to determine whether or not laws are legal, because it is indeed possible for a law to be illegal. The Supreme Court decides whether or not it is. The judicial branch expanded in that first year, 1789, when Congress realized that the Supreme Court was not enough, and they created 13 district courts and 3 courts of appeal. We now have nearly 100 district courts, and we have 12 courts of appeal within our system, so it will continue to grow. So those were the branches of government. Now let's take a look at what government's going to do. One of the most serious problems it had to tackle right away was debt. The United States had borrowed a tremendous amount of money during the Revolutionary War, and they had to figure out how they were going to pay this money back. It was the northern states that mostly carried these large debts because the northern states was where most of the fighting of the Revolutionary War happened. Most of the most significant fighting was in the north. The South didn't get attacked until the end of the war. Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, so this is kind of his bag, this is his thing, was called upon to solve the problem, and he did. His plan was that the federal government would take on all state debt, and we would create a national bank to manage all federal money. These things didn't exist at the time. Massachusetts' debt was Massachusetts' debt, not Virginia's. But what we create here is the national government takes on all state debt. So all the debt of Massachusetts becomes the debt of the United States of America. Virginia maybe didn't have any debt, but now all of a sudden, they're going to be helping pay back a national debt. The national bank would help them to manage all of this. What Hamilton is doing here is he's creating a play to bring more power over the national finances into the federal government. Now, Jefferson and Madison don't like this. They're states' rights individuals. They believe that the states should manage their own problems, and the federal government should really be left out of it. Federal government, we don't want it to be strong, say Jefferson and Madison. Hamilton says he does. The compromise is reached when Jefferson and Hamilton agree to allow the government to take on state debts. So Hamilton wins. But in return, a new national capital, Washington, D.C., was going to be built, and it was going to be built in a southern state. We're going to move the national capital out of the north and put it in the south. And that was kind of the deal they made. The Bank of the United States was created. Jefferson never approved of that one, but it happened anyway because Hamilton got George Washington on board. But the national capital was agreed to by both sides, and that's why we have Washington, D.C. Jefferson didn't like the bank because he believed the bank would help merchants at the expense of farmers. They'd be more likely to loan to people who are wealthy and therefore more able to repay their debts. He was right, but it wasn't necessarily the problem that he thought it would become. We did have a problem, however. During these initial stages, while Washington is still president, we have a rebellion. Once the federal government took on these state debts, that is, we created this national bank and national debt, we needed to pay it off. The federal government only had a couple of ways to raise money. One of those was an excise tax on goods produced in the United States, and the other is a tariff on imported goods. So we tax our own goods and we tax foreign goods. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods. So taxes are the way to go. We're about to raise taxes. Now, whiskey wound up being a target for these. It was hit by a very stiff tax. And Western Pennsylvania farmers in particular did not like this. They had all this grain. They couldn't move it to market without it spoiling, but if they turned all that grain into whiskey, they could move the whiskey, and whiskey only gets better with age. But whiskey was taxed. It was a luxury. It wasn't something that was needed. And they rise up in rebellion. And it became immediately difficult to raise any sort of army to put it down. George Washington eventually does. And we have here a president actually leading an army in the field of battle. That never happened again. But he raised that militia, marched out to western Pennsylvania. The rebellion kind of disappeared just as soon as they found out that Washington was there. And that was the end of it. But kind of a rocky, turbulent start. We've got disagreements in the cabinet and a rebellion to get our nation started. But we did get started. Thank you, Washington, for your service. You're going to resign pretty soon, but we appreciate it. And for all of you, thank you for watching today. And I hope you learned something. Farewell.